Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Jennifer Brick-Murtazashvili, and I'm a professor of public and international affairs here at the University of Pittsburgh. I serve as the director of the Center for Governance and Markets, which is a research center just recently established here at the University of Pittsburgh. We are really thrilled to host this event today alongside Bridge Pitt, a student organization here at Pitt that's devoted to helping students overcome ideological and partisan divides and learn to speak with one another on really difficult and contentious issues. We're also thrilled that the Department of Political Science has joined us as a co-sponsor of today's event. I just want to say that extend my true gratitude to Noah Jeanette, the president of Bridge Pitt, who is here with us today. He's a psychology major. And special words for Shaheen Kaveh, who is the founder, current vice president, and past president of Bridge Pitt. He's finishing up his PhD in the history of philosophy of science. And I just want to recognize Shaheen for coming up with the idea to host this event and bringing us all together here today. The mission of the Center for Governance and Markets is really important to understanding why we created this event in the way that we did. Our goal is to understand the diverse institutions and governance arrangements that affect social order and human well-being in the United States and around the world. We generate knowledge of ways in which individuals overcome challenges to living free, prosperous, and peaceful lives. We do this through three things: cutting-edge research, bridging the gap with the policy world, and engaging the communities where we work. So to understanding what's going on in the world, to understand what's going on in different communities during the time of COVID is really a challenge. And so one way we're trying to do this is by speaking with people with real experience, trying to do the very kinds of things that we're trying to achieve. So it's a great pleasure to have two former congressmen with us today who have enormous experience, not just talking about bridging gaps, but doing this in their own lives and in their own work. So we had originally envisioned this event as an on-campus event in April, and due to the global pandemic, we had to cancel it. So we're thrilled to be able to bring it to you here today in this virtual setting as part of our virtual conversation series. So we're so happy to have two former congressmen with us, both from the state of Florida, to share with us their experiences in Congress. They're going to tell us about their experiences, their frustrations, their joys, but also how these frustrations gave them insights into ways forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Representative David Jolly, who is a Republican representing a Democratic-leaning seat in the Gulf Coast of Florida. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2014 to 2017. We also have with us Representative Patrick Murphy, who is a Democrat representing a GOP-leaning seat on the Atlantic coast of Florida. So without further ado, I'm going to throw things open to Patrick. David will respond, and then we're going to open things up to the students at Bridge Pitt before opening up the floor to questions from the audience. And we're really excited to welcome all of you. If you have questions, we'll be able to see you. You can turn your cameras on. Just use that raise hand function, and we'll be happy to speak to you. Patrick.
All right, it wouldn't let me unmute. I'm not I've done a few Zooms. So anyway, thank you, Jennifer, for the great introduction. Thank you to Bridge for your leadership and for all of you participating. Look forward to your questions and having an informal conversation. David and I obviously would prefer to be doing this in person, and we've had the opportunity to do 35 or 40 of these around the country, different schools and platforms, and really enjoy the Q&A aspect of it, because we're living in such unique times. It's frustrating for a lot of folks that care about our democracy and want to see a functioning government. And probably similar to a lot of people on this call, equally frustrated by what we're seeing play out. Personally, I never thought I'd get involved in public service. My background, family businesses, construction, 4 generations of construction, that's all I knew. Went to business school at University of Miami, worked at Deloitte & Touche, an accounting firm, had an environmental company, and was really frustrated with what I was seeing, what I thought was a divided country in 2010, and what I thought was a partisan environment, and got frustrated by an individual that won by the name of Alan West, a Tea Party member, and basically said, who the heck am I to sit here and complain and point a finger? So many of the issues being discussed about the economy and the future of work and debt and unemployment, climate change, all things that I thought were going to affect my generation more than my parents and grandparents. So said, who the heck am I to sit here and complain? Why don't I get involved? So anyway, I had a great team. Anthony here on the call was the campaign manager in that race. And we ended up winning what is now, I think, still the second most expensive race in congressional history. It was like $30 million spent, which is just absurd if you think about it. And we won by just over 2,000 votes. That in itself was an experience, to talk about. But when I got to DC, I was going to change the world, right? Like, why else run for Congress? You're going to do some big, great things. And I get there, and the very first thing that happens is they basically separate the two parties. They put the Republicans over here, they put the Democrats there, and start almost like indoctrinating you. And I thought that was frustrating, so started this new, sort of group of members of Congress, and it was all about bridging the divide between Republicans and Democrats. And we decided that we would focus on some easy issues. Let's not worry about some of the social issues that divide us. Let's talk about reducing our country's debt. Let's look at wasteful spending, some of these, I would think, easy items. Anyway, long story short, end up putting forward a bill, something like $300 plus billion of savings of government waste, right? Like a really easy bill. And I've been working with a Republican on this bill after 2 months of being in office. And just as we're getting ready to introduce this bill, Jen, my Republican counterpart comes to me and says, hey, Patrick, the Speaker of the House at the time, John Boehner, found out I was going to work with you on this bill. And, it might actually make you look good. So I actually can't do it anymore. I got to remove my name from it. So you can do it on your own, but you're not going to have any Republican support. I'm like, what do you mean? We've been working on this for months. How could you do that? He said, well, you're in a tough seat, Patrick, and we're trying to beat you in, 2 years from now. God forbid you have a bill that makes you look good. Maybe in like 4 or 6 years, we'll give you that credit. And at that point, I was like, what is going on here? Busting our butts, right? Republicans and Democrats working so hard, here to make a difference. And I can't even find a co-sponsor for a bill to reduce wasteful government spending because the politics is more important than the actual policy. And I say that story not to be partisan because Democrats do that to Republicans too, right? That goes both directions. And David's got a story he can share if he likes about a similar event that happened to him by Democrats. So when that happened, it was like a wake-up call to me that we have some fundamental issues in our government right now that are preventing any sort of progress. And I don't want to bore everyone by going through them all, but just some of the top items that maybe we can dive into in the conversation are the gerrymandering the districts, which to me is probably the single biggest problem we have with democracy. You look at the vast majority of congressional districts, like 90% of congressional districts, right, are pretty much predetermined at this point. You look at the amount of money in politics. I mentioned how much my little congressional race was. Look at what's going to be seen in this presidential race in a couple months from now. And then the media, right? The ultra polarized media that we have. And that's just not, the TV anymore. That's the social media. That's the chat rooms. That's this highly tailored web environment that we live in that can be so manipulated. And that's getting us well beyond just partisanship and into this world of just total misinformation and no fact checks. So it's a very slippery slope we're on, and you start adding up all these factors, and it's led to an ultra partisan environment that we have to try to fix. So it's conversations like this that I think are so critical. So my former colleague and dear friend David Jolly, I know, has got some stories and experiences that I know he wants to share with everyone to kind of kick things off. And while we might not have agreed on every issue exactly, I think we do agree, and these fundamental changes that have to probably take place to save our democracy. So I'll hand it over to my buddy David and hear from him, and then look forward to all the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick, and thank you, Jen, and to the Center for Governance and Markets at Pitt and to Pitt Bridge. Thank you. Look, if we ever are going to change the politics, it starts with conversations like this. And I would kind of bring it all home to some pretty baseline principles. The first principle is one of human behavior, that we do the things for which we get rewarded in any walk of life, right? From grade school to sitting down and being quiet, you get your snack, to studying, you get the better grades. If you spend the time studying, you get rewarded to it. Any walk of life, any profession, you do the things that allow you to advance and allow you to succeed and keep your job. Another human behavior element I would inject into this is from a rhetoric position, from a human behavior position. We often enter arguments as a debate for which we want to win, as opposed to one from which we want to reach some agreement or some consensus. And that's a natural human behavior. The way we have rigged our democracy today rewards all the wrong things. It certainly rewards the fight over the solution. We know that, we see that every day. But in terms of the human behavior it rewards, the political behavior, it rewards the partisan. It rewards partisanship. And so when Patrick and I talk critically about our time in Congress and some of the behaviors we see, it's not really to beat up on members. They're simply doing the things that get them reelected. And so when Patrick and I left and realized we had very similar experiences, Patrick a Democrat in a swing district, me a Republican in a swing district, we realized that we witnessed the same things, which was the behavior of members of Congress were driven by the rules that, frankly, the two major parties and incumbent representatives have put into place. Patrick mentioned gerrymandering as a good example. I like to mention how we run our primaries, that they're mostly closed primaries. And on campaign finance, we are dominated by a very heavily partisan, dark money campaign finance environment. And what does it create? It creates an environment where if you are a Republican or a Democrat and you're in a 60-40 district, which, as Patrick said, 90% of them are, you only have to perform in a partisan fashion to get reelected. You never have to think about the competing views of your constituency. Similarly, if your state has closed primaries, the only voters you face of any consequence are really just the voters in your party. So that naturally pushes you to the more informed, more energized, and more polarized, either far left or far right voters in terms of their voting behavior. Suppose we were to pull the carpet out from underneath that. Suppose we were to create as many electorally competitive districts as possible. Suppose we were to open primaries so that all voters participate, and most importantly, candidates have to respond now to all voters. Suppose we had some type of public financing of campaigns and elections that really began to remove power from the partisan pocketbooks that are largely based in Washington, D.C. We would change the incentives, we would change the model, and we would change the political behavior of the candidates that often drive us to frustration. At the end of the day, I think the frustration that underlies all of this, anytime somebody says our politics is broken, it's not working, why can't the parties get along? The common element, the through line there, is the notion of accountability. We're frustrated as voters because we feel that the behavior can't be checked at the ballot box, right? There are times, if you're a progressive or a conservative, you want to see strong progressive or conservative behavior. There are times you want to see consensus. But at the end of the day, our frustration is that we have no means of accountability if we see politicians acting in ways that don't reflect our community, our constituency. So look, no one solution is going to solve all this. Patrick says it's kind of a three-legged stool. If you can begin to chip away at one leg, the others get into finer focus. The U.S. Senate, for instance, isn't encumbered by gerrymandering, but it is by a hyper-partisan primary system, a hyper-partisan money system, and then as Patrick mentioned, and one of the hardest nuts to crack, a media environment where frankly there's not a for-profit model around truly objective consensus news-driven media. Right now we have media platforms that's engaged in confirmation bias. They give us the news we want to hear. So there are a lot of challenges. The good news, and I'll close with this, Jen, is for those who are really interested in disrupting the power of the duopoly, if you will, that's been created by this system, is that in many states across the country, voters have the power to make these changes. In Florida, we went to fair districts, which requires more geographically compact districts. Now, I'm not sure that's the final answer. In fact, it made the Florida delegation more partisan, not less. But in Arizona, you removed drawing congressional lines entirely from politicians. You have independent commissions. In states like California, on the primary system, they moved to a top two primary system where the top two candidates, regardless of party, come out of the primary and move to November. In Maine, we see ranked choice voting, where voters get to rank the candidates 1, 2, 3. So you're seeing these experiments with democracy reform. The data is relatively new because it's really a modern era of democracy reform in response to some of the modern era of rigging our democracy, if you will. But the data is good, and it's allowing voters to empower ourselves to say, look, we just want a level playing field so that at the end of the day, what does get rewarded are the solutions, not the fight. There's always a place for the fight. It's politics. It's passionate. But at the end of the day, the country's better when we find solutions that give voice to the greatest number of constituencies. We're not seeing that today. And so, look, Patrick and I, this is kind of a labor of love. We like pulling back the curtain. It's not to tell tales on our colleagues or to criticize, but to say we don't have the government we deserve, in part because we've set up a system that rewards the dysfunction. We'd like to bring an end to that, unrig the democracy, empower voters, and create a more representative democracy. So thank you to Pitt. Thank you to Bridge Pitt. Thanks to Patrick, who we suspended this 2-year tour. This is our first time back together, and it's here at Pitt and virtually for everybody who's joined us. Thank you for being with us today.
Great, thank you so much. And before I open things up to the audience, just a question for the two of you. I've read a lot about what you've tried to do. I know you have a book coming out on these solutions to overcoming division. But overcoming division really requires citizens who are engaged, who are mobilized, requires people willing to overcome these divides and engaging on the topics that are so important to the kinds of reforms that you've just outlined, David, in your discussion. But we're at a time when people, trust in institutions is at a terrible low. In the United States, people say, okay, politicians, they've always behaved this way. We know we can't trust them. But trust in institutions, right? That we're really seeing, deep decay of that. And I know that many of the solutions that you've laid out seek to address that. But how is that feasible when you have half the polity, even more than half the polity, who seems to be just checked out, not really so interested, and then another half that's super partisan and super mobilized, really along extremes? How do we overcome that trust deficit in the institutions?
Patrick, you want to take that?
Sure. I'll go first. You're absolutely right with the distrust in institutions. I was involved in a panel a couple of years ago. I don't remember the exact numbers, but in the 1950s, all the major institutions had well above 60, 75% approval, whether that's the Catholic Church, whether that's CEOs, whether that's politicians as a whole, firefighters, police, army, etc. And you look at some of the recent polling, and all of those, right, are basically well under 50%, sometimes well under 20%, like members of Congress, like the body of Congress, right, is like 9% or something. You look at what's happening with police, right? By and large, there's been a lot of frustration, right, on both sides there. The Catholic Church, the Boy Scouts, right? You just go industry by industry. And my first reaction in that panel was, holy cow, this is crazy. But then you realize, you know what? It's not like it's just started, right? It's not like CEOs just all of a sudden started becoming greedy and Catholic Church started doing what it's doing and all these other institutions, right? This isn't like a new phenomenon. It's been going on for a long time. We just have awareness of it now, right? And I think there's a positive to that with that awareness can come some positive change. I think it's an ugly period to get through that change. It doesn't happen overnight. And we happen, I think, to be living in the middle of this sort of revolution, this technological revolution, this information revolution. And it's going to be an ugly few years, if not more, to get through that. But got to believe in sort of the fundamentals of our democracy. But like you said, Jen, it's going to take people getting involved, more than that 50% sort of threshold there, to actually show up and vote. And whether you like this administration or not, you certainly got a lot of new people on both sides of the aisle activated, talking at least about it. I'm really curious to see what the turnout really ends up being. Again, on both sides of the aisle, that the people really show up and voice their concern at the ballot box. But whoever wins, I hope there's a concerted effort, starting hopefully with the Congress. I don't see any administration, but really trying to push forward some real avenues of change where there's some truth and what we're seeing from the media and some of the major sources, and really looking at some of these sort of experiments that David was mentioning in some states that are looking to a less partisan sort of design of the districts, whether that's the ranked choice, whether that's an independent panel, starting to bring that forward, starting to bring back some respect and regular order to the conversation. One of the simple things, Jen, that gets passed by in Congress is just the lack of relationships. Right? It kind of sounds silly, but 40 years ago, members of Congress lived in DC. They went with their families, they were friends, they went to dinners, they played golf, and they did just social things together. And they built a sort of bond, right? Like a human connection. That's entirely missing now because members of Congress fly up at the last possible minute on Monday just so they can make that vote on Monday, and they are out of there Thursday afternoon to get home to go start fundraising and start doing rallies and events in their district. And there's no more human connection. Just something simple like that, like forcing members of Congress, you can't force them, but and encouraging them to be there more, or discouraging the amount of fundraising time that they had. So if you told members of Congress, hey, you can't fundraise until 12 weeks out from your election, right? Then, hey, maybe you don't need to race to New York City or San Francisco to go do that fundraiser. Maybe you're going to have your family stay in DC, and you're going to go get to know a colleague from the other side of the aisle and actually talk about these issues. Because it turns out most members of Congress aren't as divided as the media wants you to think. When you actually sit down and get to know them, there's a lot more common ground than not. It's just finding those parallels and then moving them forward. But that does take trust and time.
I would add, if I could, Jen, and I apologize for looking away. I'm trying to solve the sound issue. A couple things. First, never underestimate the power of conversation, of person-to-person conversation. Certainly what Bridge Pitt's trying to accomplish, and I know the Bridge organization on, say, 30 campuses or so forth, also at the Center for Governance and Markets. What I mean by that is I was on a call just before this where we were breaking down the numbers of the number of voters in the last presidential election for the two major candidates, at least, was right around 130 million people. On any given night, the combined audience, on a good night, combined audience of CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, those highly engaged, intense voters, on a good night, it totals 13 million. So you look at the scale. 90% of the country is not regularly viewing some of the news media where we get the hyper-partisanship perhaps on display. Certainly they're on social media, and so that's a powerful force as well. So don't overestimate the power of one person talking to 10 and those people talking to 10 each, and how that grows in terms of advancing civil discourse and reasonable discourse. I'd also say two things. This is where campaign finance comes in. Most people are informed by prepackaged 28-second messages that are financed with billions of dollars. It is fundamentally breaking our political system, one where I've done a 180-degree turn. I would have made the argument before money in politics is speech and should be protected. Now I think we should get commercials off the airwaves. I think it's corrupting, and I'm a personal advocate for public financing of campaigns. But the last piece also, I think voters need to see somebody with a spirit of civil discourse, willing to work across the aisle. They need to see a candidate win on that platform. And that goes to where Patrick and I are talking about creating a level playing field. We do think if you were to create a competitive level playing field, that perhaps more responsible political leadership might emerge and be rewarded, and it would renew a faith. And I think we would see leaders emerge that followers would reward with their vote.
Great, thank you. Before we open it up to questions, I'm wondering if our colleagues from Bridge Pitt would like to ask anything to our guests. Noah or Shaheen?
Yeah, I guess I could go first. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Perfect. So one of the issues that I've been thinking about for a long time, and this happened a bit in 2016, and is definitely happening right now with the Biden-Harris ticket, is the tendency for you to have really harsh primary campaigns for presidential elections. And then you kind of have people settle for the people who win no matter what, because it's easier to agree with your party and to kind of coalesce around that than to actually like keep up opposition. And I think that's not a great thing, because it shows how relative people's morals are when they're dealing with these issues. But I can't really think of a way around it, right? Because like when I talk to people, they're like, well, I really don't like Biden, but there's no way I'm voting for Trump, which it makes sense if you're a Democrat. And, people that are like, I really don't like Trump, but I'm not voting for Biden, which makes sense if you're a Republican, because you can more or less kind of guess what their policies might be while they're in office. So, and I know that kind of doesn't work for like third party candidates. And that's another reason why people are like, don't vote third party, because you're just wasting votes. I guess, how do you break out of that kind of two-party gridlock? Is that possible? Like, what are the ways that you guys have thought about going about that?
I'll just say real quick, we're saying, at least in Florida, I don't know the numbers nationwide, but in Florida, the largest group by registration is the NPA, right? That third party NPA, not Republicans, not Democrats. So the millennial Gen Z group, I think, are fed up with the nonsense from both parties and looking for that alternative. It's going to take time for their voice to be heard. Number one, they've got to vote at a greater percentage. And as they get older, historically they will. And I think that'll open the door for that true third party candidate. David and I have both spoken to several well-funded groups around the country that are really trying to push this third lane, this alternative lane that isn't so extreme on so many of the issues, and give that funding, because unfortunately that's what it takes to get off the ground, to a candidate at a senator level, a governor's level, a house, et cetera, that maybe can start to get a little bit of a coalition. If you can do it once on a big scale, I think that'll give more encouragement to others to not only run, but to actually write checks to support that third party. Because of all the issues we want to change, the money in politics has been around for a long time. Will probably continue to be there for a long time. And it is a sort of necessary evil for now until the rules change. But getting that funding to those third parties, I think, is critical.
Yeah, and I would add to that, and this is where I got to put a plug in for radical reform of our primary system. We allow the interest of the two major parties to dominate the rules of primaries and elections. And we shouldn't, because they are partisan activities. They're closed party groups. They're not governing groups, if you will. And look, there's an argument to be made for closed primaries, right? It's a private party. The courts have said you have a freedom of private association. So why should somebody who's not a member influence your nomination process? I think that's all true. And I think the open primary movement has just emerged into a sweet spot where that's addressed, but there's still practical reforms that can be done. So what's on the ballot in Florida this year, I think, is a very good model. And it looks a little like this. The two parties, or whatever party, right, we'll concentrate on R's and D's, can have a nominating process. They can have a private nomination process if they want to pay for it. It's a private party activity. And they can choose a candidate. They choose Sally as their nominee. The Democrats choose Fred as their nominee. Sally and Fred go to the primary ballot, now a statewide primary ballot, as the party's nominee. But any other candidate that qualifies also appears on that ballot. So you might have 15 or 20 candidates on the primary ballot. You have the nominees of the party. You also have other R's and D's, or Green Party or Independent Party or no party affiliation. They all appear on one primary ballot, and all voters in the state, regardless of voters' registration, get to vote. And the top two that emerge then go to November. What you've done is you've protected the right of private associations like parties to choose their preferred candidate, to designate their candidate in front of all voters. But you flipped the script and you've empowered the voters now, all voters in a state, instead of empowering the parties that currently control the system, to choose the top two candidates that represent the most diverse constituency within their state or their district. And then those two have a choice, are chosen between in November. You see something like that in California right now. These are tough waters to navigate because you do have to protect the party's interests. But if we were to do that, you would see the behavior of candidates change. Again, going back to my first point, because the reward would be there for representing a constituency ahead of a party. I am a big proponent of open primaries, and I would encourage anyone who has a little bit of an interest, investigate it and see how it could change our politics.
Great, thank you. Shaheen, did you want to follow up?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, both congressmen, for being here. I mean, just the fact that, you know, Democrat and Republican are friends, I think already is huge. And so it's wonderful to have you here. It's very much in the spirit of Bridge Pitt and Bridge USA. And so I wanted to ask about that, about having conversations across the spectrum. And, you know, I'm wondering, first of all, like, do you two argue about politics, and do your arguments ever get like heated or contentious, you know, as friends? You know, my partner and I have conversations about politics, and we have a lot going for us in terms of common ground, and even so, it's still it's, you know, it gets passionate and heated sometimes. So I was wondering if that ever happens to you, and what strategies you have for disagreeing, for civil disagreement, which, you know, is sort of considered a bad thing these days. And so, yeah, so what strategies do you have to have cordial conversations where there's, you know, intense disagreement? And what would you suggest as the response to someone who says, why should we talk to the other side? I come across this a lot as a bridge person, where, you know, I pitch bridge to someone and they're like, well, why? Why do you want to talk to a bunch of evil people or whatever, right? And so what would you say that, I mean, I have some responses I think of sometimes to give, but what would you say to someone like that?
Hey, Patrick, let me take a quick brush and then you can answer it more thoroughly. I'd say, and I love the question. And yes, Patrick and I disagree on several things, but I think our relationship is similar to others, including the constituency across the country, which is on 90% of the issues as a country, we largely agree. We really do. We just choose to let the 10% that we disagree on actually stoke the division. And we know what those issues are, right? Some of the issues around cultural issues being the ones that come to mind right away. But I would suggest, as a tool of conversation, a tool of friendship, a tool of voter engagement, back things up to the baselines that we all agree on. You know, on the issue of healthcare, we went through a decade of fighting over the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. The reality is, I think most people agree that we should have quality healthcare that is more affordable and more accessible to more people. It's not a Republican or Democratic principle. The question is, how do we arrive at that? We all agree that in the United States, we should be protecting basic human freedoms. That's why we have a constitution first and foremost. What do those freedoms look like? But once you've established on healthcare that we agree on those principles, or on human freedoms, we agree on creating as much freedom, protecting it. Those are baseline agreements that do bridge, right? As you're certainly attempting to do at Pitt. And then I think from there, it's a more reasonable conversation around policy, not around the passions that we sometimes conflate with policy.
Great, thank you. You know, I'd like to open things up to the floor right now to see if any of our attendees have questions, and we have some coming in. Now, let me see if I can figure this out. Jalon Alexander has a question, so I'm gonna, oh no, the question is gone. Oh, there's Jalon.
Yeah, hello. My question's for both of you, and it actually stems from a former colleague that you might have had. So in the state of Pennsylvania, we had the late Senator Arlen Specter, who had similar careers to both of you, changing parties kind of later on in his career, going from Republican to Democrat. And one of the things I wondered is, and it's unfortunate because a lot of the issues that you're talking about today, he was writing about before he died. And a lot of your commentary focuses on institutional changes or what voters can do individually to kind of help bridge the divide. But could you speak maybe more specifically to what you think the office holders or the candidates, like the legislators, have to do? Because I think about something like the First Steps Act that was passed 2 years ago. It was a bipartisan criminal justice reform bill. But in the literature for years now, there's been a lot of consensus on some of these issues, but there's like a big lag time between the bipartisan consensus and the actual passage and implementation of these bills. So not speaking more so to voters or the institution, but what do you think the individual legislators have to do when they're elected to office that they aren't doing now to bridge these divides beyond building like casual working relationships?
That's a great question, but before we let them answer, could you just tell us, you know, who you are, and are you a student at Pitt, or because we have the whole world here?
I'm Jelon Alexander. I'm a Pitt alumni, and I'm a cybersecurity attorney currently in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
Patrick? Okay, I'll take a quick, thank you for the question. Look, I think we can talk about structural changes, we can talk about voters. At the end of the day, though, it's fair to talk about the expectation we put on our politicians to lead, right? They ask to hold the public trust, and we should expect that they honor that public trust. I think the best politicians are those who are not afraid of losing their jobs. And I would put Arlen Specter in that group, somebody who within his own party was willing to try to represent his state first and worry about the political consequences within his party later. I do think there's a human element here that, again, is true not just in politics, it's true in any walk of life, but we see it in politics, which is leaders have an opportunity to lead or follow, or politicians have an opportunity to either lead or follow. Too often we see followers because it's safe and it's easy for them to get reelection. Just don't make any waves, don't create controversy. The true leaders that emerge are those who try to lead public opinion in the greater direction of the American story, if you will, around issues of justice or equality or peace or prosperity. And anecdotally, though I know for Patrick and I, perhaps our generation, it was more of a political issue than it is now. Take the marriage equality issue. Look, that was one that the Republicans were late coming on board. And frankly, I don't even know if they truly are on board. As a Republican running for the first time, though, I supported marriage equality from a constitutional principle. And what I did with the leadership currency I was given by my voters is I tried to have the conversation in a way that led particularly conservative Christians to a place where they could embrace marriage equality. So I talked about it in the context of empowering your church, right? If you believed in faith-based principles around marriage, then that's an opportunity to empower and celebrate your church and the freedom of faith and religion that we have in the United States. And God bless you, whatever your view of family and marriage is within that faith context. When the Constitution recognizes diversity of thought, diversity of faith around the principles of marriage and family, it shouldn't threaten that core faith that you have and is protected. Look, I didn't win that argument. Frankly, I lost it. I have the bruises to show, but it's an example of how we should put an expectation on politicians and elected officials to lead, not follow, because we know in our hearts the direction we need to go. I think we're disappointed when we don't see it from our elected officials.
Joel, I'll just add on to that. Great question, by the way. I was shocked when I got elected how many members of Congress are followers, not leaders. Right from the outside, I was always thinking, wow, there's these great leaders in our community and they're going to do what's right and they've got this great moral compass. But back to what David said early on in the presentation or in this conversation was, we're all humans at the end of the day. And no matter what, Joanne, at your cybersecurity job, you probably want to keep it, right? And Jennifer wants to keep her job, and members of Congress want to keep their job. And you end up figuring out how to keep your job, right? You show up at certain hours, or you work this hard, or you perform this, or you sell that, whatever it is. And as members of Congress, you got to raise a certain amount of money and go on TV this much and then vote a certain way, and you keep your job. By and large, I'm simplifying it, but that's what it's become. And every now and then you do see a leader really step out. John McCain, all right, in the Senate, took that courageous vote with the healthcare, Obamacare repeal, right? Could say he saved it, at least for some time. Very rarely are you going to get a majority of members of Congress to be brave on the same day on the same vote. You might get it, here on one vote and there on one vote. But by and large, they're going to fall in line. And there's a lot of pressure and pressure points that leadership puts on members of Congress. It's not right. I'm not trying to justify it. It's simply, human behavior. So as members of Congress, as senators, leaders in the community, I think talking about, some of the frustrations, trying to explain to their constituents why they're voting a certain way, why their position is what it is, I think is a starting place. But you can only, say reject money for so long before you lose, and you can only, stand up to leadership for so long before you end up losing your seat. And then the old, sort of circle of death is, well, if I'm not here, then I can't do what's right anyway, and I can't really be a leader, so I might as well just stay along for the ride. Because one day I'm going to be in that leadership position where I'm going to do what's right. And by the time you get there 20 years later, you're so corrupt, you don't even know what right is. But whole different discussion.
Jalon, did you want to follow up with anything, or he's gone? Okay, any other questions from our audience? I have many. So while we're waiting, we're trying to figure out this function. And if you have questions, you can either raise your hand, we could put you on video. You don't have to be on video, just let us know, or you can type your question in the Q&A. So, there was talk about the two of you running for governor on a ticket together to be governor or a lieutenant governor of Florida on a sort of bipartisan ticket. And I'm just curious to know, why that never happened, or are you still thinking about doing it? I think it would be a great example for many of us on bipartisanship and overcoming these difficult divides.
Yeah. I'll let Patrick take that one.
In some ways, I regret not doing it because if for nothing else, it maybe would have been an example for others that it's possible to do. Early on, when we were talking about it, was for the obvious reasons that David and I agree on more than we disagree on. We are living in an ultra-partisan environment. If we could get elected at that office, we could really prove to the state and maybe beyond that Republicans and Democrats can get along and can really solve problems and get legislation that actually lasts and not get up in these silly partisan fights. In hindsight, I think we would have come in dead last in the primary, but I think we could have won the general election. I think actually we would have had a pretty good shot at that. And that just speaks right to the problem though, right? When you think that we would have come in maybe dead last in the primary, there were some, friends of ours, both of ours running on both sides of the aisle and all that. I'm not trying to disparage them and their hard work. But again, it's this system that is so rigged, where in a primary, in states like Florida and many others, you've got something like 13% of voters showing up to vote, right? 13%. Right, we could pretty much tell you exactly who those voters are going to be. It's the same group of people in a congressional race or a mayor's race or a governor's race that are going to show up basically every single time. And when the primaries close, like in states like Florida, you got to appeal to that same group of people. by and large, that group, whether it's Republican or Democrat, are going to have more partisan leanings. And the minute they find out that a Republican and a Democrat are coming together, that word compromise gets in their head, and maybe some of their issues that they care so much about, maybe that's choice, maybe that's guns, or maybe that's healthcare, you name it, all of a sudden might be bending in their mind, and they're probably not going to vote for you because those are probably the most ardent voters. So again, that kind of speaks back to these structural problems that we feel have to change. And if you can fix one of them, you can, start to fix the rest because they're all connected. And that's kind of the unfortunate situation our democracy's in.
Yeah, I would just add to that very quickly, Jen. I said my piece on primaries, but Patrick's point there should be a takeaway for all of us. I mean, we went to the extent of having polling, very extensive polling and surveys, and we knew in a general election that the state would reward a unity ticket, a Republican Democratic ticket. I certainly couldn't get through a Republican primary given my disavowal of the president. And as Patrick mentioned, the politics within the closed Democratic primary, a moderate bipartisan ticket could not win that primary. But ballot access in November has to go through those primaries. And so again, it is an obstruction to the emergence of a new politics. And the advocates for open primaries are not trying to undo the two major parties. We're trying to level the playing field on behalf of voters. We could have seen a difference in that decision of Patrick and I had we had a level playing field.
Right, Shaheen.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask a second question. The issue of campaign finance came up several times and raising money. And this has always been a question I always wanted to ask someone who's actually been there on the ground, how this works. I mean, we hear things about Congress people spend 70% of their time on the phone trying to raise money and stuff like that. But my question is specifically, all of that doesn't prove that any representative changes their vote because of money. If you're pro-oil, of course oil companies are going to give you money. That doesn't mean you're pro-oil because they give you money. It means it could be the other way around, right? They give you money because you're pro-oil. So have you ever in your time in Congress seen someone actually change their vote because they realized if they didn't, they would lose some funding, some donation or something?
All the time. Patrick, you got a good one here.
You're the 60 Minutes star, so you go on this one.
No, well, look, I appreciate the way you frame the question. Does money persuade or does it reward, right? And it's two sides of the same coin. Either way, it's corrupting because it's interfering with objective decision making. I would say the need for money is what is corrupting. And this is why I support taking commercials off TV, because it's the number one cost driver. 80 to 90% of money typically is spent on very high cost television ads. So there are some European models where you can mail all you want, but they don't allow political content on their TVs. I realize there's some constitutional concerns. For me, it's a value judgment. Look, I think we have public television that taxpayers invest in, and we could say to qualified candidates, you get X number of minutes each night within 30 days of an election on public television to allow access of messaging between the candidates and the voters, and then stop paying to run commercials. That would eliminate the cost driver. It corrupts the amount of time of elected officials. We have a part-time Congress and a full-time world because they're too busy raising money and looking over their shoulder to who's going to give them the next check. And yes, it changes votes. Patrick and I have a former colleague who his vote on Obamacare was driven by needing conservative money in his next race, not the more progressive votes. He needed money to run his campaign as opposed to the votes. And so he voted in a way that was against his own personal convictions as well as those of his constituents.
And Shaheen, now, to the first part of it, the money itself, what direction it goes in being corrupting or not, it does go both directions. Sometimes someone is supportive of an issue and the money follows. Of course that happens. But as David said, we know plenty of examples going the other direction. And it doesn't have to be in your face, right? It's not like someone needs to offer you a certain amount of money for you to know where they're at. Whether it's a union or the Chamber of Commerce and certain business groups, the votes, they make it very clear publicly that, hey, this is a key vote. I'm watching you. Okay, like you can get between the lines. I'm watching you means they're going to write you a check one way or the other or go against you perhaps, right? So no matter what that is going to be in people's head. But what I would say, arguably even more important, is the amount of time that is spent doing this. You said 70%. I think it depends on the member of Congress, but there's no doubt that 10 to 40, maybe even more hours a day, hours a week are spent by members of Congress trying to raise money, going to these call rooms, going to fundraisers, traveling around the country. That in itself should just frustrate the heck out of voters, because I want my member of Congress learning an issue, right? Really, diving in and studying both sides of it and trying to come out with a nice, response and answer why they voted a certain way. Not going around begging for money. I mean, I sort of make the joke that members of Congress are telemarketers with a cool title, right? I mean, that's what it's become, because they're sitting there on the phone begging for money all the time, and that's disgraceful for our democracy. When we have so many issues that are becoming more and more complex, that's where the time should be spent, is understanding those issues, not begging for money.
Shaheen, you had a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. I realized I can mute myself, but I can't always unmute myself. So, so I wanted to follow up because I've thought about this issue a lot of campaign finance, and I'm trying to figure out like how this thing about money influencing vote can work. Because if, let's say, Representative Murphy, a Democrat, you represented a Republican-leaning or swing district. If you ever were to take a vote to raise taxes 50%, right, you would lose your seat, I assume. No matter how much money billionaires gave you, right? Like if whatever, or the other way around, right? Like if you represent a Democratic-leaning district and you take a vote to dismantle Obamacare, you probably lose that seat, right? Regardless of how much money you got from whoever. Or am I wrong about that? And so it seems like the influence would only be on issues that voters don't care about or is not decisive in their vote. Maybe foreign policy and things that voters don't really think about too much, that they don't get outraged about. But if it's anything that voters can get outraged about, I don't see how the money can offset the loss of voters.
I'll go quick. I know David's a little short on time. I don't want to be like too mechanical about that, but it depends on sort of the extent of the offense, right, of what the vote is, and then the timing of it. Like say that vote happens a month before Election Day. It's going to be hard to mount a campaign on that issue against that candidate, right, depending what the issue is. With the resources as well, you can muddy the waters often on a lot of issues. We're seeing it more than ever, the misinformation and lies that are out there on both sides. I was always surprised when I went through like the polling of the district or the state, what issues really matter to people when you like sort of ask them to rank, hey, here's 10 issues, rank them in importance. So that, in that example, that issue that you're talking about would have to be one of those top 2 or 3 things. Otherwise, people probably aren't going to run an ad against the candidate on it, or they're not going to pay a whole lot of attention because they've got 1, 2, 3 that ranks ahead of it that they like you for. But sort of just broader speaking about this question really speaks to, I think, the advantage that David and I had being in districts that were toss-ups, because we could be who we want. Right? There was no like pressure from the super liberal district that I had to be so liberal or a super conservative seat. It was a toss up, right? So I could make a value assessment on every single vote, doing what I think was best, because it was right in the middle. And, it's hard to design like all these congressional districts to be perfect toss up seats. And that's maybe not emblematic of society. But if you had more competitive seats you would have more members of Congress being honest about their votes and really doing it for the right reasons, because it's not going to sway it like one way or the other as dramatically when you've got that balanced field there.
Thank
David,
you.
Yeah, David, did you want to add anything?
No, I would just add a campaign perspective, perhaps, which is the money is not necessarily there to promote your position, right? So if you're taking the right votes, an organization could come in with $1 million to back you, but it may not be around that vote. It may just be you need that type of messaging out there. And that I'd also encourage you to think about two different campaign and election models. And you're seeing it in the presidential race, a turnout model versus a persuasion model. In hyper-competitive districts, it's a turnout model. It's not actually often a persuasion model. And what I mean by that is you spend money to energize your traditional partisan voters, not to try to convince people from the other side of the aisle to vote for you. That's where you get into these bidding wars, if you will. These seats become commodities, and you see the cost of elections get driven up on both sides.
Great. And I just want to wrap up with one final question to the both of you. You know, we're in election season right now. We're watching, I think, many of us with anxiety about how the election process is going to play out, regardless of who you support. And, you know, I'm wondering, everybody seems so polarized at this particular moment. And I'm just wondering, what is the hope for many of the ideas that you're speaking about, given the election? How do you think things are going to turn out over the next several months? Do you think there is any hope for the kind of bridging that you're speaking about?
Go ahead, David. I know you got to run. So.
Yeah, I would say we are a nation that has never been defined by our politics. We're defined by our principles. We're defined by the fabric of liberty and the path towards greater justice and peace and prosperity. We truly are. It's hard to remember that sometimes in this environment and even the media that we enjoy consuming. But as an American people, for generation after generation after generation, it has been a journey of increasing strength, not of weakness. And I think the anxiety is because we feel our politics are broken, but we're not a nation defined just by our politics. In fact, in many ways, we're a nation defined by all things not political. There's a greater experiment to this nation than that which we see on the political stage. So don't let the division of our elected leaders translate all the way down to division within our communities. We feel it. Campaigns get heated. We know that. Talk to your neighbor. You've got more in common with your neighbor, and we believe in the greater view of America than sometimes what we see on the TV airways. I'm incredibly optimistic, and I would say to my Democratic friends who are working very hard to defeat the president because they see the president as an obstruction, not a lot is going to change in terms of our natural political divisions after this election. We do need to expect more from our leaders, whether they play to those divisions or try to heal those divisions. But our system is still encumbered by some basic structural problems that will always reward the partisanship unless we work to change it. That's why Patrick and I are on this little tour and why we appreciate Pitt and Pitt Bridge being a host to us.
Great, thank you. And I know you have to run, so thanks for being with us today.
Jen, I'll just
really appreciate
add to that. I must be watching too much TV. I'm very concerned about the elections and what's to come. I do generally, of course, I agree with David. I am optimistic about our democracy and big picture, and do agree with what he said at the end that regardless of who wins, that, you know, these fundamental pillars of money and gerrymandering and primaries and earmarks and lack of relationships and cameras in the committee rooms and all these sort of nuanced things we didn't even get to yet that have led to this fundamental sort of breakdown of our democracy aren't going to change just on their own. It's going to take people really getting active. But I would also say, as it relates to this election specifically, you know, people always say it's the most important election ever. It sure seems it, right? It sure seems like a big one. It sure seems that some of those fundamentals not only are becoming more partisan, but truly becoming rigged, right? And we've got, I'm a Democrat, I can, I guess, openly say it. I don't need to try to be nonpartisan on this forum. A person in the White House who's really, truly tearing down a lot of the sort of fundamentals of this democracy, whether that's Department of Justice, whether that's respect for so many institutions and individuals, and really breaking down that overarching trust in democracy, and just the example of questioning mail-in ballots and their security and the authenticity of this election coming up. The fog that has already been presented around the election results in November could have some pretty serious effects come November 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th as mail-in ballots come in, and there's going to be accusations that the ballot boxes were rigged, and you're going to see all sorts of crazy things get thrown out. And when you break down the trust in a democracy and an election, that's a really slippery slope, right? All of a sudden, you just have no idea what's going to happen when you have the president saying that it was a rigged election, right? From the teleprompter, from the White House. And that to me is really scary, right? I think we're crossing certain lines that have never been crossed in our democracy from the highest of offices. And it's not just happening on its own, right? There's plenty of other countries helping this happen, right? They would love to see America hurt from the inside and weakened and taken to its knees. So, this isn't just like the president to blame. There's a lot of help happening here. So I hope people look at the bigger picture of our democracy and try to respect its fundamentals and then try to improve it come November 4th.
Great. So on that happy note, we'll wrap things up today.
Sorry.
I just want to thank the both of you for joining us. I know you're very busy and it's a very busy time of our political lives. So I'm really grateful for having you, for taking the time. I know we tried to schedule this so long ago. And, a huge shout out to our friends at Bridge Pitt for supporting this, for making this event possible, and for doing the incredible work that they do. If there's students here, I just hope that they get involved with their work. We need to model this as faculty members. We need to model this as citizens, as students, and it's just really important to be able to have these kind of conversations. So thank you again. Thanks to everyone out there for your great questions. We're looking forward to seeing all of you again. And it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.